He has no self-control. He can't keep his criticisms. If it's about personas, if it's about character, she wins. And she'll win easily.
Top Republican pollster Frank Luntz is once again sounding the alarm after Donald Trump's latest unhinged outburst and public display of insecurity and panic, in which Trump ranted on Truth Social that the 2020 election was stolen from him, that widespread voter fraud is still common in this country, and that once he wins the 2024 election, he will punish the cheaters, aka Democrats, in the form of prosecution and long-term prison sentences from a Trump administration's Department of Justice. Yikes. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we have a couple of things to look at in this video, but we're going to start with an unhinged rant from Donald Trump, courtesy of Truth Social. Now, Donald Trump, as you know, malignant narcissist, ideologically inconsistent, and unprincipled populist, right? And he's somebody who skates by on bravado, right? I'm winning in every poll. I'm up by 3 million. If Jesus himself were here, I would have won California by 80 kabillion votes. He says stuff like that on camera, right? And you're always wondering, is he just lying? Is he so dishonest? Is he just a pathological liar? Or is he so profoundly stupid to the point of delusion? And perhaps at various points, it's one or the other, right? He can be just really dishonest in one respect, really delusional in a different respect. But here, it suggests to me that Trump is aware on some level that this election is going to be close and that Vice President Harris does indeed have a legitimate chance of beating him, because he's ranting about the 2024 election, baseless claims of voter fraud in 2024, and then he issues another unhinged threat. So he says, cease and desist. I, together with many attorneys and legal scholars, am watching the sanctity of the 2024 presidential election very closely because I know, better than most, the rampant cheating and skullduggery that's taken place by the Democrats in the 2020 presidential election. It was a disgrace to our nation. Therefore, the 2024 election, where votes have just started being cast, will be under the closest professional scrutiny. And when I win, those people that cheated will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, which does include long-term prison sentences so that this depravity of justice does not happen again. We cannot let our country further devolve into a third world nation, and we won't. Please be aware that this legal exposure extends to lawyers, political operatives, donors, illegal voters, and corrupt election officials. Those involved in unscrupulous behavior will be sought out, caught, and prosecuted at levels unfortunately never seen before in our country. That is Donald Trump, again, making baseless, dishonest, lying claims of voter fraud in the 2020 election, which he lost freely and fairly to President Biden by 7 million votes in the popular vote, and then in the Electoral College by the same margin that Trump himself defeated Hillary Clinton in 2016. They had been audited and recounted multiple times, and more often than not, it actually expanded President Biden's margin of victory. He's making baseless, dishonest claims about that. And he's making baseless, dishonest claims that widespread voter fraud is prevalent in 2024, even though there's no evidence of that. The Heritage Foundation, a right-wing think tank, would be salivating at evidence of such things, and they just simply don't have it. And then, of course, the threats. We'll get into the threats, but top Republican pollster Frank Luntz, one of the best in the business on the right, is once again sounding the alarm. In response to this, he said, I have never seen a candidate more determined to blow an election. Instead of talking about affordability and immigration security, the top public issues, Trump is once again screaming about prosecuting his opponents. Message to Donald, focus on helping voters, not yourself. Luntz is giving this advice free of charge because he wants Trump and the Republicans to win. He is a conservative Republican pollster who has backed the Republican ticket, Trump or no Trump, for years. He is begging Trump to stay on message, and not for the first time. And we're going to play a clip of Luntz here in a second from a recent conversation he had on CNN, once again basically begging conservatives and Trump supporters to somehow get this man to get on message. But notice Luntz also recognizes that Trump has a history. This is nothing new. Trump has a rich history of threatening his political opponents. As a candidate and also as the sitting president, that's also something worth talking about. But before we do, let's play this clip of Frank Luntz from a recent CNN panel in which he discusses the stakes of the election, how Trump can win, and also the threats posed to a Trump victory, mostly from Trump himself.
Trump's strongest position right now is the policy differences between him and Harris. Inflation, which I call affordability. Immigration, which I talk about national security and the sense of safety and security. These are areas where Trump has the advantage. If it's about personas, if it's about character, she wins, and she'll win easily. If it's about policy, Trump has a 10-point advantage on affordability, a 10-point, 12-point advantage on immigration. So he has to go. And the problem for Trump is he has the inability to do that. He has no self-control. He can't keep his criticisms. And if I'm her, I'm trying to find one word to summarize everything that she's thinking as Trump goes after her. And that word is really?
I have a feeling that we might hear that. I mean, actually, Frank, just going.
So this is what's so fascinating. Again, he's giving it away for free. No riddles or anything. He's like, listen, Trump has an advantage on key polling areas, which is sad because they are not based in reality whatsoever. But unfortunately, the American electorate really believes that Donald Trump is fiscally responsible and better for the economy, even though the macroeconomic data says otherwise. But these are one of many unfair advantages enjoyed by the Republicans. Fortunately for those of us who oppose Donald Trump, those of us who are Democrats, those of us on the left, Trump is just generally too stupid to exploit those many, 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 many institutional advantages. That's what he says. Luntz is saying Trump has the inability. He is incapable of impulse control and self-regulation and self-awareness. He's just too reflexively stupid and vindictive. What good is it for him to do what he's doing? The Washington Post talked about this recent unhinged Trump rant. Trump pledges to jail opponents, baselessly suggests election will be stolen from him. Or scroll down just a little bit. David Becker, who founded the nonprofit Center for Election Innovation and Research, urged the public to reject Trump's inflammatory language. Quote, I can't begin to describe the abnormality and disturbing behavior that would cause a presidential candidate, a former president, to threaten public servants with mass arrest, said Becker, who previously worked as a lawyer for the Justice Department for 7 years. Several election officials also called threats of violence, quote, unacceptable, end quote. Quote, Donald Trump will not accept the results of the election unless he wins, says Colorado Secretary of State Jenna Griswold. Quote, this is another step in his campaign to undermine confidence in our elections, which has led to unprecedented threats of violence against election officials, end quote. A spokesman for the Trump campaign did not reply to a request on Sunday afternoon for comment on Trump's post. And my God, why would they? How could they possibly spin it? I imagine when Trump does these things, his campaign, led by Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita, seasoned, bad faith, but seasoned political operatives, they're probably smacking their forehead that Trump is determined to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. Of course, it goes on to say that, Trump has made some tacit roundabout concessions that he lost the 2020 election recently. We've done videos on this. He kind of let it slip during a conversation, a panel hosted by Moms for Liberty, and then again in a subsequent debate with centrist podcaster Lex Friedman. So Trump, again, it betrays that Trump knows deep down he lost that election, but he just can't let himself admit it, right? Because it is so antithetical to who he is. I'm a winner. Reportedly, he hates the word loser. That is his least favorite word. That's the word that he can't stand to be called the most, right? This idea that he could lose, that he could be defeated freely and fairly, that somebody's just more popular or more preferable than he is something he can't fathom. As Governor Ron DeSantis, of all people, Republican, Trump-supporting Governor Ron DeSantis now, as he said famously, when Trump was in reality TV and he lost an Emmy, the Academy's rigged. This guy just can't fathom that he is imperfect and therefore is subject, like anybody else, to setback and defeat on the merits, not because he was cheated. The Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, I've referenced this article before, but they're a nonprofit which go after corruption, not just Republican corruption, I might add. They go after Democratic corruption as well. Bob Menendez, Henry Cuellar, they have written scathing articles and op-eds about these two Democrats. It just so happens, unfortunately, that in the modern age, Republicans are much more likely to be corrupt than elected Democrats, so they focus a lot more on Trump, because Trump is uniquely corrupt. But they have an article on this. Trump has threatened dozens of times to use the government to target political enemies. Donald Trump has repeatedly promised to weaponize the federal government during a second administration by pursuing revenge, retaliation, and retribution against his political enemies. Because Trump is primarily on Truth Social, his newly public social media company with only a niche following, the extent of his threats have mostly flown under the radar. Trump's attitude can be summed up in one Truth Social post from August 2023. Quote, "If you go after me, I'm coming after you." Crew analyzed over 13,000 of Trump's Truth Social posts from January 2023 to April 1st, 2024, and found that while Trump has recently backed off of some of his more violent rhetoric, threatening political opponents has been a consistent fixation for Trump. Since the start of last year, Trump has directed or has issued direct or implied threats on Truth Social to use the powers of the federal government to target President Biden during a second Trump administration 25 times. Specifically, Trump has threatened him with FBI raids, investigations, indictment, and even jail time. But Biden is not Trump's only target. He's also threatened or suggested that the FBI and Department of Justice should take action against senators, judges, members of Biden's family, and even non-governmental organizations. Trump's posts should not be taken as empty threats, but rather as a call to action for Congress to put in place meaningful guardrails against the weaponization of the military and federal government's law enforcement agencies before it's too late. And it goes into detail, listing many, many, many examples. Also talks about what should be done. As Cruz noted for years, the DOJ's and FBI's impartiality is key to advancing accountability, justice, and safety at a time when domestic violence extremism is rising. Congress should pass the Protecting Our Democracy Act, POTA, which would curb abuses of power by presidents of both parties and strengthen Congress's ability to fulfill its constitutional role as a check on the executive branch. One important part of POTA is the Security from Political Interference and Justice Act, which would prevent the White House from interfering in the work of law enforcement and the DOJ, including exerting pressure to prosecute the president's political enemies. POTA passed in the House on a bipartisan basis in December 2021, but most of the bill was never taken up in the Senate. As Trump repeatedly threatens to use law enforcement against his enemies, Congress should also prepare for the potential that he would attempt to use the military for retribution as well, courtesy, by the way, of the Insurrection Act, which is largely, alarmingly, non-justiciable. So legal experts and constitutional experts have said this is a tremendously potent tool in any president's arsenal. It goes back, its current iteration, I think, was in the early 1800s, but the genesis of the Insurrection Act fundamentally began with the Washington administration. You have to remember that this was basically an emergency power to let the president use the military for domestic law enforcement purposes, like with respect to, curbing terrorism. But it was built for somebody like George Washington. President Washington, a statesman, somebody who would not lightly use that power. Donald Trump repeatedly threatened to use the Insurrection Act towards the end of his first term. Why should we believe that he wouldn't do it if he's more unhinged and more determined than ever to punish his enemies in a second Trump administration? And those same legal and constitutional scholars say that there are very few, if any, checks that even the Supreme Court could impose on the Insurrection Act because it's designed to be non-justiciable, up to the discretion of the president. That's terrifying. So much of our system of checks and balances and our constitutional order is predicated on good faith from statesmen, no matter what their party is. And here's the thing, as awful as the Republican Party has been for decades, and indeed it has, this is not new to Trump. The Republican Party, in my opinion, was not a great political party until 2015 or 2016. It was awful even prior to that. But at least with a President Mitt Romney or even a President Bush or a President H.W. Bush, a President Reagan, we need not really fear that they would have used executive power the way that Donald Trump wants to do, abuse executive power. They had terrible policies. Trump has terrible policies and an authoritarian streak a mile wide. And that is why Frank Luntz is panicking, because the more Trump advertises that to the world, the more he turns off median, moderate, independent voters that he needs to win the election. And you and I and everybody else, in my opinion, have an obligation to make everyone aware of Trump's mind state, of his mental state, and how he wants to punish people who vote against him or oppose him for winning free and fair elections, and why he can't possibly be trusted to win this next election, why we must vote against him if we're eligible voters. And in the meantime, you let me know what you think in the comments.